In the grand narrative of history, some chapters are repeated so often that their lessons echo loudly across generations, while others remain almost hidden, spoken of in whispers or not at all. Farrakhan reminds us of this imbalance, how the world knows, with justified outrage, the horrors of the Holocaust. Yet so many remain unaware or are deliberately shielded from the full story of America's own long night of slavery, lynching, and the brutal oppression of black people. This is not a contest of suffering. It is a call for truth, for a nation that proudly proclaims liberty and justice for all. Confronting every part of its past is not only a moral duty but the only path to a more honest future. Imagine the weight of centuries when families were torn apart, when human beings were bought and sold as property, when entire communities lived in fear of sudden violence. These are not distant echoes. Their consequences still shape neighborhoods, schools, and opportunities today. Yet for far too long, this reality has been softened or overlooked in classrooms, ignored in textbooks, and brushed aside in polite conversation. To understand the present, we must face what came before it, because the scars of history do not fade simply because time has passed. This story is not about pointing fingers at a single generation. It is about understanding the forces that built a nation and how those forces continue to influence the lives of millions. From the plantation fields to the rise of Jim Crow laws, from the era of mass incarceration to present-day inequities, each chapter reveals patterns that can only be broken when we shine a light on them. When a society hides its own painful truths, it risks repeating them. But there is also a story of strength, of communities who refuse to be defined by oppression. Black Americans fought again and again for dignity, equality, and the right to shape their own destiny. Their courage and resilience have enriched the nation far beyond measure. Knowing their story is not just about acknowledging pain. It is about celebrating the human spirit that refused to be crushed. As you watch and listen, I invite you to be part of this journey. Let us explore the untold chapters together, with open hearts and minds. If you believe that understanding history, every part of it, is essential to building a better tomorrow, then join this conversation. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends who value truth and justice. Your voice, your curiosity, and your commitment to learning are powerful tools. Together, we can keep these lessons alive and ensure that the full story of America's past is finally heard and never forgotten. Within the world's most powerful country lives a nation within a nation. A people whose journey has unfolded alongside the great American story, yet often in its shadow, carving out their own path while the world celebrated the nation's triumphs of freedom and democracy. These are the Black Americans whose ancestors were once brought to these shores in chains, whose sweat and labor built the foundations of a rising republic, and whose descendants have spent generations fighting and bleeding for the very rights that the nation proudly claims as universal. Their story is not merely a footnote to the grand narrative of the United States. It is a vital and unbroken thread that reveals both the country's highest ideals and its most profound contradictions. When the Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, these men and women were held as property, their humanity denied in the very moment a young nation proclaimed liberty. The Revolution's cry for freedom rang across the Atlantic while fields of the South echoed with the cries of those who toiled without pay or promise, their lives measured in profit and loss rather than dignity and worth. Yet even then, within this nation that was rising to power, a second nation was forming, a people bound not only by the shared trauma of bondage, but also by a stubborn belief in the possibility of justice, in the dream that America's promises could one day belong to them as well. Generations passed and the Civil War brought an end to slavery, but the chains of injustice merely changed their form. Black Americans emerged from emancipation with hearts full of hope, only to find new barriers waiting, laws written to confine them, customs designed to remind them that the words "all men" still did not mean all. They built schools when none would teach their children, formed businesses when others refused to trade with them, and worshipped in churches that became sanctuaries of resilience and the heartbeat of a culture determined to survive. This nation within a nation endured Reconstruction's collapse and the cruelty of Jim Crow. Their progress met at every turn with resistance meant to break their spirit. But there was no breaking it. The 20th century brought fresh winds of change and new battlegrounds. From the Great Migration that carried millions from the rural South to the industrial North, to the Harlem Renaissance that exploded with art, music, and literature, Black Americans redefined not only their own identity but the nation's cultural soul. They claimed space in factories and on stages, in classrooms and on city streets, turning pain into poetry and hardship into invention. Yet even as their achievements enriched the nation, the promise of equal rights remained elusive. Voting rights were suppressed, economic opportunities narrowed, and segregation, both legal and hidden, continued to shape where they lived, worked, and dreamed. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s became the next great chapter in this long struggle. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to the bridges of Selma, voices rose with a clarity and moral force that could not be ignored. Marchers faced fire hoses and jail cells, but their demand was simple and unshakable: that the nation live up to the words it had written in its own founding documents. Their courage forced open doors that had been shut for centuries. Yet each hard-won victory revealed how deep the roots of inequality still ran. Even in the decades that followed, new challenges emerged that were more subtle but no less destructive. Economic disparities persisted. Schools in many communities remained underfunded, and systems of justice often turned a blind eye to fairness. Policies like the war on drugs and the rise of mass incarceration created yet another set of obstacles, reshaping lives and families in ways that echoed older forms of control. And still, this nation within a nation refused to disappear into silence. Writers, artists, activists, and entrepreneurs continued to rise, challenging the country to confront its contradictions and fulfill its highest ideals. To speak of a nation within a nation is not to speak of division, but of reality, a recognition that Black Americans have carried the dual weight of being both the makers of America and the constant witnesses to its unfinished promise. Their contributions have touched every corner of national life, from music and literature to science and politics, shaping the culture and the conscience of the United States itself. Their resilience has revealed a deeper truth: that the strength of a nation is measured not only by its power but by its capacity to reckon with its past and to embrace the full humanity of all its people. Today, when we walk through cities built on the labor of the forgotten, when we listen to the rhythms of music that grew out of struggle and hope, when we vote, debate, and dream of a more just society, we are walking in the footsteps of those who formed this living, breathing nation within the larger nation. Their story is the American story, complex, painful, triumphant, and still unfolding. To understand the United States without understanding this journey is to see only half the picture. And to honor it is not merely to remember injustice, but to recognize the unbreakable spirit of a people who turned centuries of hardship into a legacy of courage and an ongoing call for justice that continues to challenge and inspire every generation. He warns that those who have long ruled the United States are not the true allies of Black people. And the record of history, when examined without illusion, proves this again and again. To see this clearly, one must step back and follow the arc of the American story, not just the heroic episodes celebrated in classrooms, but the quieter, darker undercurrents that have shaped the experience of a nation within a nation. From the moment enslaved Africans were forced onto these shores, their labor exploited to build the wealth of a young republic, there was always a gap between the lofty language of freedom and the reality lived by those whose humanity was denied. The leaders who drafted declarations and constitutions spoke of liberty as an unalienable right, yet they built systems designed to withhold it from those who were Black. and across generations that pattern persisted in new and insidious forms. When the Civil War ended and the abolition of slavery was finally enshrined in law, the dream of equality might have seemed within reach, but almost immediately the promise was undermined. Reconstruction, with its brief moments of possibility, was crushed beneath the weight of political compromise and violent resistance. Black men who had dared to hold office and shape policy were driven out by terror and intimidation. Legislators, judges, and governors, those entrusted with the nation's ideals, looked the other way or even joined in the effort to keep a whole people from claiming their rightful place. The language of the law became a mask for oppression as the so-called Black Codes, and later the Jim Crow system, drew invisible walls around every aspect of life, determining where people could live, work, and learn. The rulers of the land presented themselves as guardians of order and democracy, yet their actions betrayed an unspoken truth. The equality they professed was never meant to be shared in full. Even when the 20th century dawned with promises of progress, the same pattern revealed itself in subtler ways. As black families fled the South during the Great Migration, seeking opportunity in northern cities, they encountered new barriers, housing covenants that confined them to certain neighborhoods, employment practices that limited advancement, and a justice system that too often failed to protect them. Political leaders gave speeches about unity while quietly maintaining the structures that kept communities segregated and struggling. The nation's rulers spoke of the American dream, but for many, that dream remained out of reach, a vision always just beyond the next horizon. The civil rights movement challenged this facade with extraordinary courage. Marchers filled the streets, pastors and students faced arrests and violence, and voices rang from pulpits and podiums demanding that the United States live up to its own creed. Some in power eventually responded, signing landmark legislation and proclaiming a new era of equality. Yet even as cameras captured the triumph of these moments, others worked behind the scenes to blunt their impact. Economic inequalities were left largely untouched, and new policies emerged that would, over time, create different forms of exclusion. The war on drugs and the growth of mass incarceration devastated neighborhoods, dismantling families and undermining the hard-won gains of earlier decades. The language of law and order became the new disguise, and those in leadership, while declaring their commitment to justice, overlooked or even enabled the widening of these disparities. It is this long pattern, stretching across centuries, that gives weight to the warning that the rulers of the United States have not been the steadfast allies they often claim to be. The evidence is written in the very fabric of the nation's development. In the way black communities were systematically denied fair housing loans while suburbs flourished. In the way schools remained unequal despite court rulings. In the way wealth accumulated in some hands while others were locked out of the means to build it. At each turning point, the rhetoric of inclusion was there, but so was the quiet persistence of exclusion. And yet, to acknowledge this history is not to surrender to bitterness or despair. It is to see with clear eyes the distance between words and deeds, and to understand why trust must be earned through action, not simply promise from podiums. Black Americans have never waited passively for salvation from those in power. They built their own institutions, nurtured their own leaders, and kept alive a culture of resilience and creativity that no policy could extinguish. From the spirituals sung in hidden corners to the jazz that reshaped music around the world. From community schools and churches to movements for voting rights and justice. They have demonstrated that the strength of a people does not depend on the goodwill of those who govern. Today, when we look back across this landscape of struggle and perseverance, the warning carries a deeper meaning. It is not a call to reject dialogue or cooperation, but a reminder that liberation cannot be given as a gift by those who have historically withheld it. Real change has always come when communities demanded it, organized for it, and held leaders accountable. The story of Black America is proof that progress is possible, but also that it is never inevitable. Each generation must push the nation closer to the ideals it claims to embody. In telling this story, we are invited to move beyond comforting myths and to reckon with the complexity of a country that can inspire hope while also inflicting harm. To hear the warning is to understand that true allies show themselves through consistent action and through the dismantling of the very systems that have long denied equality. Only then can the promise of America, so often deferred, become more than a dream. An enemy is not someone who simply dislikes you, but any force that deprives you of life, freedom, justice, or equality. And when we trace the long journey of Black Americans inside the world's most powerful country, this truth becomes painfully clear. From the earliest days when human beings were brought across the ocean in chains, the real adversary was not merely the individual slaveholder or the neighbor who looked away, but the entire network of laws, customs, and economic systems that turned human lives into property and made oppression a cornerstone of national wealth. It was the force of a society that celebrated liberty in speeches while denying it in practice. A structure that disguised itself in patriotism and progress yet thrived on the suffering of those whose rights were never intended to be equal. An enemy can smile, can speak the language of unity, and can even hold the highest office, while quietly ensuring that freedom remains out of reach. This understanding threads through every era of the American story. After the Civil War ended the legal institution of slavery, many believed the worst was behind them, that the promise of emancipation would lead to true equality. But the enemy simply changed form. Reconstruction offered a brief glimpse of democracy expanded, with black men voting, holding office, and helping to rebuild the South. Yet the same forces that had once defended slavery regrouped, now wearing the cloak of law and respectability. They wrote new codes, enforced them with violence and fear, and rolled back the fragile gains of freedom. The chains were no longer visible, but they bound lives just as tightly through segregation, disenfranchisement, and a terror that kept families awake at night. The enemy was not a single face but a system of power determined to keep a people in their place. As the 20th century unfolded, the disguise grew more sophisticated. Millions fled the South during the Great Migration, hoping to escape the old oppression, only to find that in northern cities, different but equally potent barriers awaited. Banks drew invisible lines on maps, refusing loans to black families who dreamed of owning a home. Schools in their neighborhoods remained underfunded, their children's futures quietly limited by budgets and policy decisions made far away. Employers hired but seldom promoted, and political machines promised representation while maintaining the status quo. The enemy was not a stranger lurking in the shadows, but an entrenched force woven into institutions economic, political, and social that claimed neutrality while perpetuating inequality. Even when the civil rights movement shook the conscience of the nation, when the courage of marchers and the eloquence of leaders forced open the doors of legislation, the enemy adapted again. Overt segregation became illegal, and the language of equal rights entered the nation's laws. But subtle strategies replaced open exclusion. The war on drugs and the era of mass incarceration swept through black communities with devastating consequences, removing fathers and mothers from their homes, reshaping entire neighborhoods, and building yet another mechanism of control. Politicians spoke of safety and order. Courts claimed impartiality. But the result was the same. Lives limited. Futures stolen. Freedom deferred. The enemy, once obvious in chains and whips, now hid behind the language of policy and the complexities of law, but its purpose remained unchanged. To see the enemy in this way is to recognize that it is not about personal dislike or individual prejudice alone. It is about any force, be it an institution, an ideology, or a pattern of practice that denies human beings the chance to live fully and freely. It may be the economic structures that create vast gaps in wealth and opportunity, or the political strategies that suppress votes and silence voices. It may be the quiet neglect of schools and neighborhoods that keeps generations struggling to climb out of poverty. It may even be the complacency of those who claim to value justice while refusing to confront the inequalities in front of them. Such an enemy is not bound to a single century or a single set of leaders. It evolves with time, adapting to new circumstances, always seeking to preserve its power. And yet, throughout this long history, Black Americans have never allowed the enemy to define them. They have met each form of oppression with resistance and creativity, turning hardship into art, protest into policy, and pain into progress. From the spirituals sung in the hush of hidden meetings to the jazz and blues that transformed music around the world. From the fiery speeches of the civil rights era to the quiet determination of community builders and educators, they have shown again and again that the human spirit cannot be permanently subdued. Their victories, some celebrated, others barely recorded, prove that the enemy, no matter how persistent, can be challenged and overcome when people unite in purpose and refuse to surrender their dignity. Understanding the enemy in these terms is not a call to hatred but a call to vigilance. It is an invitation to look beyond surface appearances and to measure every institution, every policy, every promise against the standard of life, freedom, justice, and equality. It demands that we ask whether the structures around us truly serve these values or merely pretend to. It reminds us that progress is not a gift handed down by those in power, but the result of relentless effort by those who refuse to be deed. The lesson of history is clear. To secure freedom, one must recognize the forces that threaten it, not just in the obvious moments of crisis, but in the quiet persistence of everyday injustice. This is the thread that binds the story of a nation within a nation to the larger American narrative. It is the recognition that the greatest struggles have never been against individual animosity alone, but against the systems and practices that strip people of their rights and humanity. To name such forces as the true enemy is to speak an uncomfortable truth, yet it is only by naming them that a society can hope to dismantle them. And in that naming lies both the warning and the hope that while the enemy can change its form and adapt to the times, the resolve to confront it, to expose it, and to replace it with justice remains a power greater than any force of oppression. Like animals that appear friendly until food is scarce, systems of power can pretend to be allies until their control is threatened. And in the long, complex history of Black Americans living as a nation within a nation, this truth has revealed itself time and again. The relationship between those who hold authority and those who struggle for equality has often been presented as a partnership, a shared effort to build a fair and just society. But beneath the surface the reality has been far less stable. Power, by its very nature, seeks to preserve itself, and when resources, influence, or cultural dominance seem at risk, even the most eloquent promises of unity can shift into quiet resistance or open opposition. What once looked like friendship can dissolve the moment the balance of control begins to tilt. This pattern was clear in the earliest days of the Republic, when leaders declared that liberty was a birthright for all while continuing to profit from the labor of enslaved people. To the world, America spoke of freedom and opportunity. To those who built its wealth in bondage, it offered only hardship and chains. For a time, the illusion of partnership was maintained, as if the nation could grow in strength and moral authority while denying basic rights to millions. But when the fight for emancipation threatened the economic and political order, the mask of friendship slipped. Civil war came not because of sudden cruelty, but because the demand for freedom challenged the very structures of power that slavery had built. In that moment, the supposed allies of liberty revealed how quickly they would defend their position when their control appeared to weaken. After the war, during the brief era of Reconstruction, there was again a moment when it seemed that the nation might embrace equality. Black men held office, schools were built, and for a fleeting time the promises of the Constitution seemed within reach. Yet as soon as the political strength of newly freed people began to grow, Those who had once spoken of national healing recoiled. Alliances dissolved. Federal troops withdrew, and laws were rewritten to strip away the rights that had barely been won. The friendly face of reconciliation hardened into Jim Crow segregation. A carefully constructed system designed not merely to separate, but to ensure that power remained in the same hands. The scarcity was not of food but of privilege and influence, and the response was to guard it fiercely. The Great Migration of the early 20th century offered another test. Millions of black families moved north and west in search of better opportunities. And for a while the industrial cities welcomed their labor. Factories needed workers, and political leaders courted their votes. But when economic pressures tightened during the Great Depression, or when black communities began to assert themselves culturally and politically, the tone shifted. Redlining confined them to overcrowded neighborhoods. Unions excluded them, and policies were crafted to limit their rise. The same society that had smiled at their arrival turned cold when it sensed a challenge to its long-standing hierarchy. Like animals that share a meal in abundance but bare their teeth when the supply runs low, the powerful revealed that their alliance had always been conditional. Even in the age of civil rights legislation, when marches and moral appeals won landmark victories, the pattern did not disappear. Public figures who once praised the courage of activists grew wary when calls for economic justice, fair housing, or deeper structural change threatened entrenched interests. The war on poverty gave way to the war on drugs, and policies that claimed to restore order ended up destabilizing black neighborhoods and feeding a new cycle of incarceration. Politicians who had promised equality began to speak of law and order instead, and the systems that had briefly seemed to open their doors found new ways to reinforce old divisions. The friendship of power lasted only as long as its own position remained secure. This recurring shift teaches a difficult but necessary lesson. Alliances with those who hold power cannot be measured by words alone, but by the actions they sustain when their own authority is at stake. It is easy to speak of justice when justice costs little, to embrace equality when equality does not threaten the balance of wealth or influence. The true measure comes when progress demands a redistribution of opportunity, or a rethinking of long-established privileges. History shows that in those moments, systems of power will often retreat behind walls of policy and bureaucracy, protecting themselves while insisting that nothing has changed. Their smiles may remain, their speeches may still invoke unity, but beneath the surface the instincts of preservation take hold. Yet the story of Black America is not one of passive betrayal, but of active resistance and remarkable endurance. Time after time, communities have recognized the difference between genuine partnership and convenient alliance. They have built institutions of their own, nurtured leadership that does not depend on the approval of those in authority, and created art, music, and culture that affirm their identity and strength. From the spirituals of the enslaved to the blues and jazz that reshaped global music. From the organizing of civil rights leaders to the quiet work of teachers and entrepreneurs. They have proven that their survival and progress do not rely on the fleeting friendship of those who guard the gates of power. To see the pattern clearly is not to reject cooperation or dialogue. It is to understand the nature of power and the necessity of vigilance. True allies show their commitment when the cost of equality rises. When sharing influence means surrendering some measure of control, anything less is a performance, a mask worn until scarcity whether of resources, votes, or cultural dominance makes the teeth show. The lesson is not one of cynicism but of clarity. Freedom is secured not by the goodwill of those in charge, but by the unyielding determination of those who demand it. And as history continues to unfold, the warning stands: systems of power will always appear friendly in times of abundance. But only those who remain steadfast in their struggle will ensure that liberty and justice are not lost when the supply of privilege runs low. Long after the shackles of formal bondage were struck from wrists and ankles, the shadow of that system lingered like a stubborn mist that refused to lift. Freedom, promised in bold declarations and celebrated in parades, quickly revealed itself to be a fragile and conditional gift. The Emancipation Proclamation and the constitutional amendments that followed sounded like the opening notes of a new national song, yet the melody was quickly drowned by the harsh dissonance of reality. In the years that followed the Civil War, black codes sprouted across the southern states like weeds thriving in scorched soil. These laws were carefully crafted instruments of control, limiting the movement, labor, and economic prospects of those newly freed. A man could be arrested for vagrancy simply for being unemployed, and the punishment often meant being leased back out to work in conditions not so different from the plantations left behind. It was a bitter irony: freedom transformed into a trap that allowed exploitation to flourish under the guise of legality. As Reconstruction faded and federal troops withdrew, the vacuum of protection opened the door to a new age of terror and control known as Jim Crow. Separate schools. Segregated transportation and the humiliating rituals of separate but equal became everyday reminders that equality was still an elusive dream. Signs posted above water fountains and train cars were more than symbols. They were declarations of a hierarchy the nation refused to dismantle. Behind these signs lay a network of violence and intimidation that ensured the system's survival: lynchings carried out in broad daylight, the quiet threat of night riders, and the constant reminder that challenging the order could be fatal. Generations grew up navigating a landscape where survival demanded both courage and caution, where the smallest act of defiance could have life-altering consequences. Even when the legal architecture of Jim Crow began to crack under the weight of the civil rights movement, the machinery of racial control proved endlessly adaptable. The language of oppression shifted, shedding the obvious markings of segregation and adopting the subtler codes of policy and politics. In the late 20th century, the war on drugs emerged not simply as a campaign against narcotics, but as a powerful instrument to police and confine black communities. Politicians promised safety and order, but the new laws and mandatory minimum sentences fell with disproportionate force on neighborhoods already struggling with poverty and the legacy of disinvestment. Police sweeps, stop-and-frisk tactics, and aggressive sentencing turned minor offenses into lifelong entanglements with the justice system. Families were torn apart, parents vanished into prisons, and entire communities bore the weight of a narrative that painted them as perpetual suspects. Mass incarceration became the quiet successor to the chains of slavery and the signs of segregation. In courtrooms and penitentiaries, the faces were overwhelmingly familiar: men and women whose lives had been shaped by centuries of deliberate inequality. The prison walls rose not only from crime but from decades of redlining. Underfunded schools and limited economic opportunity. Each statistic on recidivism or sentencing disparities told a story of systems designed to contain rather than uplift. It was a control less visible than the whip or the whites-only sign, but no less effective in limiting freedom and opportunity. And yet, through every era of imposed constraint, resistance refused to die. Churches became sanctuaries of both faith and strategy. Barbershops and beauty salons turned into forums of political debate, and music carried the voices of defiance across generations. From the spirituals sung in cotton fields to the anthems of the civil rights marches, Black Americans transformed pain into art and oppression into a call for justice. Activists and everyday citizens alike continued to challenge laws and norms, building movements that forced the nation to confront the gap between its ideals and its practices. This history is not a distant echo, but a living thread woven into the present. The names of the systems may change: black codes, Jim Crow, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, but their function has often remained strikingly consistent: to reassert control whenever progress threatens the status quo. To understand this continuum is to recognize that the struggle for equality has never been a straight path from darkness into light. It is a story of hard-won victories and relentless backlash, of hope rising even when the weight of history seems too heavy to bear. And it is a reminder that the promise of freedom is not self-executing. It must be claimed and defended, again and again, by those unwilling to let the nation forget its unfinished work. The story of black enterprise in America unfolds like a mirror to the nation's larger history, reflecting both the brilliance of creative vision and the relentless pressures of a system determined to maintain its hold on power. From the moment freedom was proclaimed, black communities sought not only to survive but to build schools when none were provided, businesses when banks refused them credit, newspapers when their voices were ignored. Out of these efforts emerged a tradition of enterprise that was as much an act of resistance as of economic ambition. In every generation, there were men and women who refused to be defined by the limitations set before them and instead created their own lanes, their own markets, their own audiences. Yet time and again, the very success of these ventures attracted the attention of those who had long controlled the flow of capital and influence, and the cycle repeated. What was built in defiance of exclusion was often drawn back into the gravitational pull of the dominant economy. Consider the story of black music, where innovation became both a path to visibility and a commodity for others to claim. Motown began as a dream in Detroit, a small label that captured the soul of a generation and gave the world a soundtrack of hope, rhythm, and unshakable pride. Berry Gordy transformed raw talent into international stars and, in doing, presented an image of black artistry that the wider culture could no longer ignore. Yet the very popularity that made Motown a symbol of independence also made it a target for acquisition. As decades passed, ownership shifted and the label that once embodied self-determination was folded into the portfolios of larger corporations whose primary allegiance was to shareholders rather than to the communities from which the music sprang. The songs remained, but the power to shape their future no longer rested entirely in the hands of those who first gave them life. The pattern was no different in the world of media. Black entertainment television, better known as BET, was born from a simple but radical idea: to create a network that centered black stories, black talent, and black perspectives in a television landscape that rarely made space for them. For years it was more than just a channel. It was a gathering place, a reflection of culture that had too often been distorted or overlooked. Yet as its audience and profitability grew, so did the interest of major media conglomerates. Eventually Bet2 was acquired by a larger white-owned corporation. Its programming shaped not solely by the vision of its founders, but by the calculations of executives far removed from the communities it once sought to represent. What began as a platform for authentic voice became, over time, another line item in a multinational entertainment empire. Hip-hop tells a similar tale. From block parties in the Bronx to global dominance, the movement began as an underground pulse, raw, inventive, unfiltered. Def Jam captured that energy and helped bring it to the world, turning street poetry into a multi-billion-dollar industry and giving rise to artists who reshaped not only music but fashion, language, and identity itself. But with success came the familiar tide of external investment and eventual control. Record deals and corporate partnerships brought resources and reach. But they also meant that the economic rewards of a culture born from struggle increasingly flowed to boardrooms that had not shared in that struggle. What started as an act of rebellion became a brand to be marketed, often by those who once dismissed it. These stories are not mere coincidences. They are chapters in the ongoing narrative of how American capitalism intersects with race. For every triumph of black ingenuity, there has often been an equally powerful counterforce seeking to absorb, tame, or profit from it. It is not that black entrepreneurs lack the vision or talent to sustain independence. History proves the opposite, but that the structures of finance, distribution, and media ownership have long been tilted toward those already in control. Banks that deny loans, investors who demand stakes in exchange for growth, conglomerates with the leverage to outspend and outcompete. All these forces create a landscape where even the most successful enterprises are eventually pressured into partnerships that dilute their original autonomy. Yet there is also resilience in this cycle, a refusal to let the story end with absorption. Each generation of creators learns from the last, seeking new ways to protect their art and their equity. Independent labels rise again. Digital platforms offer fresh avenues for self-distribution, and collective ownership models challenge the old hierarchies. The struggle to maintain control over cultural production is itself a continuation of the long fight for freedom and self-determination that began the moment the first chains were broken. It is a reminder that economic power is inseparable from the broader quest for equality. To tell one's own story, to profit from one's own creation, to define one's own future without the constant shadow of external control. This is not simply a story about business transactions or corporate mergers. It is a testament to the enduring creativity and determination of a people who have never stopped building, even when the rules were rigged against them. The names of the companies may change. The industries may shift from vinyl records to streaming platforms, from television networks to digital content, but the larger struggle remains the same. It is the effort to create something that cannot be quietly taken away, to carve out spaces of ownership that endure beyond the next acquisition offer. In this, the history of Black enterprise is both a cautionary tale and a beacon of possibility, a reminder that the fight for genuine independence is never a single victory, but an ongoing journey, carried forward by those who refuse to let their brilliance be confined to someone else's balance sheet. We often measure success by the accumulation of wealth, by the ability to write a check without hesitation, or to fund a dream with a single transaction. But the truth behind the glitter of fortune is more fragile than it appears. And the illusion of independence can shatter the moment you follow the money back to its source. Even those who reach the rarefied heights of billionaire status, who own mansions and private jets and whose names dominate headlines as symbols of limitless possibility, remain tethered to a currency whose value they do not control. The dollar they hold, the very foundation of their empires, is not shaped by their will but by central banks, government policies, and global markets that can rise or fall in the span of a single sleepless night. When a nation adjusts interest rates or when distant economies falter, fortunes can shrink without a single poor decision by those who thought themselves immune. What appears to be absolute freedom is, in reality, a dependence as delicate as a spider's thread. This dependence is not simply an economic technicality. It is a reminder of how power truly operates. Wealth can buy influence and access, but it cannot rewrite the rules of the system that determines the worth of the very wealth it creates. A stock portfolio might swell during years of prosperity, but a sudden market crash can wipe away decades of careful accumulation. A real estate empire might stretch across continents, yet its value is anchored to the ebb and flow of interest rates and consumer confidence. Even the digital fortunes of today's tech innovators, seemingly untethered from the old physical constraints, are ultimately measured in currencies whose strength rests on decisions made in rooms they may never enter. To believe that personal wealth alone ensures independence is to mistake comfort for sovereignty. For Black entrepreneurs and visionaries who have fought for every inch of economic ground, this reality carries an even sharper edge. Their victories hard-won against a backdrop of exclusion and systemic bias can feel like a claim to self-determination, a signal that they have broken free from the historical grip of inequality. Yet their success still plays out on a field owned and refereed by others, the bank that holds their deposits, the institutions that set lending terms, the markets that decide the price of a currency. All remain beyond their direct control. A sudden policy change, a financial crisis, or a global downturn can threaten to unravel decades of effort. No matter how skillfully they have navigated the obstacles of prejudice and exclusion. The lesson is not that their achievements are hollow, but that even the most brilliant individual triumphs cannot replace the security that comes from collective strength. History bears this out. When communities pooled resources to build mutual aid societies, when cooperatives emerged to provide credit and insurance that mainstream institutions denied, they were not simply creating economic tools, they were building a shield. These collective efforts recognized a truth that the billionaires, despite their immense resources, cannot escape. True independence requires shared protection. It requires networks of trust and solidarity strong enough to withstand the tremors of markets and the shifting winds of political power. Without that collective foundation, even the richest among us are exposed to forces they cannot command. This understanding reframes the meaning of wealth itself. Money is not merely the measure of success. It is a promise, one that depends on the stability and fairness of the larger system. When that promise wavers, when inflation erodes purchasing power, or when economic rules tilt in favor of those already entrenched, the numbers on a balance sheet reveal their vulnerability. Billionaires may diversify their investments, hedge their risks, and employ armies of advisors. Yet they too rely on the same fragile social contracts and regulatory decisions that shape the fortunes of ordinary citizens. The difference is only in scale, not in the fundamental dependence that ties all wealth to the same unpredictable tides. This reality calls for a different vision of security, one that cannot be purchased with individual riches alone. It invites a reimagining of power as something rooted not in isolated accumulation but in the collective capacity to protect, sustain, and direct the value of our shared labor. Communities that invest in one another through cooperative businesses, community banks, and networks of mutual support create forms of independence that money alone cannot guarantee. They build resilience that no single fortune, no matter how vast, can replicate. For those who have long struggled against the unequal distribution of wealth and opportunity, this collective independence is not simply a strategy. It is a continuation of the centuries-old quest for dignity and self-determination. And so the question is not merely how much wealth an individual can amass, but how that wealth is anchored, how it is shielded from the decisions of unseen actors and distant markets. True freedom cannot rest on numbers alone. It must rest on relationships, on the bonds of trust and shared purpose that outlast the market's unpredictable swings. Without these bonds, even the wealthiest stand vulnerable, their empires built on shifting sands. The lesson is as old as the first communities that came together for mutual survival, and as urgent as today's volatile economies. Independence is not the privilege of the solitary, but the achievement of the united. True freedom is never a single moment of triumph, never a prize that can be claimed and held without vigilance. It is a living force that must be nourished, defended, and strengthened across generations. For without organized strength, political, economic, and cultural, every gain can be slowly eroded until it vanishes like mist at sunrise. History offers sobering proof of this reality. Each time a wall of oppression seemed to crack, when slavery was abolished or segregation struck down, when barriers to voting were legally dismantled, or when new opportunities finally seemed within reach, there followed a quieter, more calculated resistance. Laws changed on paper, but policies, markets, and institutions adapted in ways that kept control firmly in familiar hands. The lesson is clear. Progress that is not reinforced by collective power remains vulnerable to reversal. Political organization is the first pillar of this enduring strength. Without it, even the most inspiring movements risk being scattered by the winds of changing administrations, or by legislation crafted in back rooms far from public scrutiny. The right to vote, once won through marches, sacrifice, and decades of unrelenting effort, demands not only participation, but the building of structures that protect representation from those who would dilute it. Communities that remain politically fragmented leave themselves open to decisions made without their voice or consent. Unity, strategy, and the patient work of building institutions that can weather political storms are the only means to ensure that victories do not fade with each election cycle. Political strength is not simply about winning offices. It is about shaping the environment in which laws are written and futures decided. Economic organization stands beside politics as an equal partner in the struggle for lasting freedom. A people who lack control over their own resources, who depend entirely on systems that have historically excluded or exploited them, cannot fully direct their own destiny. Wealth that exists only as individual success is a fragile shield, easily pierced when markets tremble or when access to capital is manipulated by forces outside the community. The history of black enterprise in America, from the rise of Motown and back to the long tradition of small businesses and mutual aid societies, shows both the brilliance of black economic creativity and the relentless efforts to draw that success back into the orbit of larger powers. True economic independence requires more than a handful of exceptional entrepreneurs. It demands networks of cooperative ownership, community banks, and institutions capable of retaining control over the fruits of collective labor. Only when economic power is organized can it resist the quiet takeover of those who would profit from the creativity and resilience of others. Culture is the third pillar, and perhaps the most subtle, for it is within culture that identity is forged, where values are transmitted, and where the stories of a people either endure or are erased. A culture that remains vibrant and self-defined cannot be easily co-opted or silenced. Yet cultural strength requires more than the creation of art and music. It requires the means to preserve and distribute those creations without surrendering their meaning to those who see them only as commodities. From the rhythms of hip-hop to the traditions of black literature and spiritual music, cultural expression has always been both a form of resistance and a declaration of humanity, but without organized effort to control the platforms, to protect intellectual property, and to educate the next generation about the significance of these works, culture can be distorted or stripped of its roots. Cultural sovereignty is not an ornament of freedom, it is its heartbeat. These three pillars, political, economic, and cultural, are not separate struggles but interlocking strands of a single cord. When braided together, they form a strength that cannot be easily unraveled. Political power safeguards economic progress by shaping laws that protect ownership and fair opportunity. Economic independence funds political influence and provides the resources to defend rights when they are threatened. Cultural strength keeps alive the identity and purpose that give both politics and economics their direction. Remove any one of these pillars, and the structure weakens, making it possible for gains to be quietly reversed by those who prefer a return to the old order. Throughout history, the moments of greatest progress have come when these forces worked in harmony. The civil rights movement achieved legislative victories not merely because of moral appeal, but because churches, activists, and communities built networks of political strategy, economic sacrifice, and cultural solidarity that could not be ignored. Their success was not the result of a single charismatic voice but of countless individuals who understood that freedom demanded organization, that change required the patient weaving of alliances and the discipline to hold them together when opposition grew fierce. And the work does not end when laws are passed or when barriers seem to fall. For every generation, the challenge remains to maintain the structures that protect the hard-won ground and to expand them for those who come after. Freedom is not a finish line. It is a practice, a continual effort to strengthen the bonds of collective power so that no backlash can quietly dismantle what so many sacrificed to build. It calls for vigilance against complacency and for a shared commitment to the institution, schools, businesses, media platforms, political organizations that will carry the story forward. True freedom, then, is not the absence of chains alone, nor the celebration of a single victory, but the enduring capacity of a people to stand together, to govern their own destiny, and to resist the slow erosion of their rights and dignity. Political, economic, and cultural strength are not luxuries. They are the very conditions of independence. Without them, progress can be undone in silence, without a single shot fired, until the freedoms once celebrated become memories of what might have been. But with them, the story changes. Freedom becomes not a fragile achievement but a living inheritance, secured not by the wealth of a few but by the organized strength of many. a foundation strong enough to withstand the shifting tides of history and to guide the next generation toward a future where justice and equality are not merely ideals but lasting realities. Recognizing the forces that work against true freedom is not an invitation to hatred. It is an act of clarity and a necessary step toward lasting liberation. To name a system that exploits, to call out the structures that quietly erode progress, is not to curse the individuals within it, but to shine light on the hidden machinery of power. Clarity is not anger. It is vision. And with vision comes the ability to act with purpose, to resist not through blind rage, but through discipline and unity. Lasting freedom is never won by the loudest voice alone, but by the steady, patient work of people who understand that liberation requires more than passion, it demands strategy, awareness, and a commitment to stand together even when the path is long and the opposition is subtle. Throughout history, communities that have endured centuries of oppression have learned this lesson the hard way. The end of slavery did not end the struggle. The victories of the civil rights era, hard won through sacrifice and unbreakable courage, were not the final chapter. Each generation has discovered that the forces of exclusion adapt, changing shape and language while pursuing the same goal: to maintain control. To remain free is to remain vigilant. Awareness is the first defense. It allows us to see beyond the surface, to recognize that progress can be celebrated even as it is quietly undermined. It teaches us to watch for the policies that sound harmless but carry hidden costs, for the economic trends that drain power from the very communities whose creativity fuels the nation. But awareness alone is not enough. Discipline transforms recognition into resilience. It is discipline that organizes communities to vote even when barriers are raised, that builds institutions capable of surviving beyond the charisma of any single leader, that saves and invests collectively rather than relying on individual wealth. Discipline is the quiet force that turns outrage into action and ensures that energy is not lost in bursts of protest, but channeled into lasting change. Without discipline, even the clearest understanding of injustice can dissolve into frustration. With it, clarity becomes power. And still, the greatest force of all is solidarity. No individual, no matter how brilliant or wealthy, can stand alone against a system designed to isolate and divide. Solidarity is the recognition that our freedoms are bound together, that the safety of one community is tied to the dignity of another. It is the understanding that collective power, political, economic, cultural, is the shield against the slow erosion of rights. Solidarity builds movements that outlast any single moment of crisis. It transforms scattered voices into a chorus too loud to be ignored. It allows us to protect the gains of the past and to dream beyond the limits imposed by history. To reach a future where justice and equality are more than ideals, we must keep these three commitments: awareness, discipline, and solidarity at the center of our lives. They are not abstract virtues but practical tools. Awareness sharpens our eyes. Discipline steadies our hands. Solidarity strengthens our hearts. Together they form the foundation of true liberation, the kind that cannot be quietly reversed by policy changes or economic downturns, the kind that endures because it is rooted in the collective will of a people determined to define their own destiny. As this story comes to a close, let it also serve as a beginning. The struggle for freedom is not the burden of one generation but the shared responsibility of all who inherit its lessons. Whether you are moved by the courage of those who came before or inspired by the possibilities of those yet to come, your voice and your actions matter. Each conversation you start, each vote you cast, each effort you make to build bridges across divides strengthens the fabric of this ongoing movement. Lasting liberation is not given, it is built, and every person who chooses clarity over complacency helps lay its stones. Thank you for walking this path of reflection and discovery. Your time, your attention, and your willingness to engage in this difficult but essential conversation are themselves acts of solidarity. If you believe that understanding the full truth of our shared history is the key to shaping a better tomorrow. I invite you to keep this dialogue alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about justice and truth. By staying connected and informed, by supporting one another in the pursuit of knowledge and change, we strengthen the movement for freedom that began long before us and will continue long after. Together, with clarity, discipline, and solidarity, we can ensure that liberation is not a fleeting moment but a living legacy, one that no force can quietly undo.